Really good to be together on this Lord's Day evening. As Michael said, we're going to dive into another set of these Ask Questions. You can submit questions on our website at fortwaynechristians.org/ask. You can also just drop them in that box over there where we put the contributions, or you can just hand it to me. I'll probably, if you hand me something, I probably will type it up and put it in the website. That's how I track them and keep a log of them. But we haven't, I think this is the first one of these lessons this year. And I've only gotten, I believe, 2 questions this year. They came in last month. And so those are the 2 we're going to answer tonight. And the first, it's a little more complicated than this, as you'll see, but is, should we have a treasury? And the second is, how do older saints connect? That's my simplified down version of these 2 issues. No real theme or relation between these issues. These are just the last 2 that came in this past month, and I want to make sure we deal with them and address them. So this idea of the treasury, and in particular, having savings in the treasury. So the questioner asks, I understand that a congregation may want a savings for unexpected emergencies, but do we have biblical authorization for this? Also, is a large amount necessary or even scriptural? Are the churches being good stewards of collected funds when they are held for months and even years? In Acts and other New Testament books, it looks like the collections were made for specific purposes and sent or distributed rather quickly. So it's a good question. And some, maybe among us or coming in from outside the congregation, might ask, well, man, that sounds like a very little nitpicky kind of a question if you're not used to these kinds of conversations. So why think so carefully? And, sometimes you hear statements like ideas like this is legalism or like the idea that somebody might think that they're perfect or that they're trying to earn their salvation or something like that. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here and in the same conversation. Our aim is to be faithful to Jesus and to do God's will. Jesus says in Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter. But whenever we're at judgment, but those who do the will of my Father. So that's our deep desire, is faithfulness. It's very important to us here. We don't get it all right. We're not saying that. But boy, we are trying to find God's will by searching the Scriptures and trying to follow it. And so we take matters of faith seriously, not to earn God's mercy, but because His grace motivates us. His grace is training us, is driving us towards honoring Him by trusting and obeying His word. And so we ask, this is a question we ask a lot, what do the Scriptures say about this? What is God's will about this? And there's 2 different aspects that are talked about here. There's this aspect of biblical authority, or what is scriptural? What do we have a biblical foundation, either a precedent or a command or a direction on? And then there's this other issue, that is brought up here, besides biblical authority, the idea of, is it necessary? Is it being a good steward? And so these are 2 very different kinds of questions. And I think that's helpful to just recognize. These are 2 different questions. What does it mean to be guided by principles like stewardship, and what's the needed thing here versus what's allowed by God? And so what kind of matter is this is the first question we have to ask. Is this a right or wrong? Is this a yes or no kind of an issue? Is this a matter of sin, right? Does this make sense? If God is saying this is not acceptable, or God has specified something else for us to do that eliminates all other options, then that is what we want to do, because we just want to do exactly and only God's will. Or is this a matter of, hey, what is the wisest way to do it, right? So on the one hand, this side over here, the right or wrong, is about what does God want me to do? And it requires obedience to God's command or His guiding precedent, an approved example, or a conclusion that, there's no other way to interpret it but to understand that this is what God wanted us to see. Versus the wise way, where it requires discernment. We're still trying to please God just as seriously, but this is a matter where we're trying to just carefully apply Bible principles to the situation, right? Does this distinction make sense, what we're talking about? Yes or no versus, okay, there's a lot of possible issues. This is an issue of liberty, so then there is a lot of possible answers, but God still wants us to tread carefully, choosing the best one. And so principles in those liberty chapters, like in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 9 and 10, where Paul talks about, well, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not everything edifies. I want to do everything to the glory of God. I'll be mastered by nothing, those kinds of things. So on the one hand, there's a question we're asking. Does God approve of churches storing funds at all? For us to collect a treasury and not just immediately, it comes in and it goes right out. And then on the other hand, there's this question of how can we glorify God best with these funds? And those are different questions. Both are important. So this first question, does the Bible authorize it? May we have funds that aren't spent immediately? And the first place we tend to go, you might think of, is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. And this is an important passage here for several reasons. It's for a particular purpose, certainly, the particular collection he's talking about, but it is where we get direction now that we can't lay something at the apostles' feet. This is the example we have and the directive that he gave not only to the church, the inspired apostle Paul gave not only to the church at Corinth, but to all the churches of Galatia as to how to do this collection for the saints in Judea. And so we see a couple of key words, and boy, we could dive into this a little bit, but just two things to note. First of all, this idea that there may be no collecting when I come. So the word collection is a word that was commonly used for a sacred kind of a collection that was used like in a Greek god's temple often. So its meaning has a religious context. But then he says that there may be no collecting when I come. In other words, he's not planning on whenever he gets there, everybody's going to bring their savings account from home and put it together. Everybody is already storing up money together in one common treasury so that there doesn't need to be a collection when he comes. And it's on the first day of every week. It's not just when they get paid. There's a particular time, the time when they're all together, gathered together, like we see in Acts 20, verse 7, that they're setting aside these funds. And so, but somebody might say, yeah, okay, so they're storing up the funds at least until Paul's coming, but that's for a particular purpose. And so, yes, we're holding on to it, but there's a clear end in mind. But this idea of a treasury goes way back beyond that, way earlier. And we just can kind of step by step our way backwards and see how far it goes back. From the earliest days of the church, we see a collection. We see the saints in Jerusalem bringing their funds and putting them at the apostles' feet, and the apostles are managing this treasury, this storehouse, whatever you want to call it, this fund that is being distributed. But it goes back before that. Before the church was established, the disciples had a treasury, had a money bag, right? And yeah, it's not earning any interest, it's not fancy, but they're storing this money up. And before that, there was in Israel a treasury. As you see in Joshua 6:19 and Matthew 27:6. And before that, there was a treasury in the tabernacle. So it keeps going back. God's people have always had a common fund for special purposes that was set aside, that was being put together. And what was it spent on? When were these funds spent? Well, we're not given a play-by-play on everything we can find out, but evidently it's as they saw needs. You see a need, and you have the funds. If you have the funds, then you can deal with it. You deal with the needs as there are funds. And I just collected a bunch of passages of examples of the church dealing with needs of the churches, individual local congregations, putting their funds together and dealing with needs as they saw them. You think of a situation like in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where there's the widows that were on a list and were being tended to. And there's a lot of different situations we might think of, but it doesn't seem that there's any particular clock that started as soon as you give the money where, okay, let's make sure this goes right back out. It's stored and it's being dealt with. It's not meant to be a forever savings account. It's meant to be used in the service of God's people, but there's also no requirement that it come as soon as it goes out. It's just being dealt with as a need arises. So does God approve of churches storing funds at all? I would say yes. We have a common treasury, just like they always have, that God's people always have. Well, then how can we glorify God best with these funds? And the answer was brought up right in the question. This idea of stewardship. Stewardship. Well, what is stewardship? What does it mean to be a good steward? I don't know about you, when I think of stewardship, my mind immediately goes to those parables of Jesus about the minas and the talents and all these things. Some of them, the kingdom parables that we might be talking about in our classes. But to steward something means to manage something, to care for it when it doesn't belong to you. And one of the things that the stewardship parables makes very clear is that stewards will at some point answer for the way that they've used those things that didn't belong to them whenever their master returns. I mean, that's a lot of those stewardship parables. They're in charge of how they're used, but they are meant to be representative in how they're used. They are making choices that they understand they are authorized to make with the master who actually owns it. And it makes me think of elders who are called stewards of the local church and also called elders and also called overseers or managers there in Titus 1, 6, and 7. Stewards of the group itself, of the church itself. And so what does it mean to be a good steward? Well, first of all, we don't want to be wasteful, right? This is our master's property. This is the resources of the master with whatever it is. I mean, our time, our energy, but right now here we're talking about funds that have been set aside for a special purpose by the group. And we want to maximize fruitfulness. And that's part of this idea of good stewardship. Again, think of the parable of the minas. We want to invest in activities that accomplish good work in the Lord. And we want to be ready for needs that arise, right? I mean, we would feel like poor stewards, I think, if something that was very important arose and we said, sorry, I guess we should have planned better, but we can't meet this important need. And boy, things come up. I only know about a fraction of them because of my involvement. Things sometimes come through me or get to me, and I pass them to the elders or to a deacon like Ralph, who's working with the elders on some of these things. But things come up all the time. Often what seems to me like big amounts. And so we want to be aware that these are issues that are real and that matter, whether it's a needy saint or, a need somewhere else in the spiritual work of the church. And so I think of how I try to make decisions to be a good steward and caretaker of my children. And as a parent, I'm trying to think about my family's needs now, and I'm trying to think about my family's needs in the future. And church leaders are trying to balance faithfully the present and the future needs. And you might think of Joseph and the stewardship of Joseph, right? As he thought about the future. You might think of some of the Proverbs 31, the woman there. Think of the ants that the Proverbs points to. But there are these principles that have to do with wisdom, discernment, being careful to choose the right thing. And I want to make a distinction here. We have to be careful to distinguish between stewarding and hoarding. We can't let fear of a future we can't control lead to stockpiling, lead to, okay, I'm going to just in fear grip at this and try to regain some control by keep building up such a pile of money in a way that I could be doing all kinds of good, but I don't know what might arise, right? And so I'm just going to pile up a ton of money. And so there's this balance. You see, I'm trying to paint a picture of context of principles that have to be carefully measured in this tension. I'll just give you two different examples. One is of a congregation that was from my family, my grandparents, and just one that I'm familiar with. They started meeting in the basement of their house. And there were a bunch of boys, bunch of kids that were grown up, so it ended up being like a family meeting place. And the whole church met in the basement, and it looked like, if you went down the basement, it looked like you went in a church building. I mean, there were pews, and there was a baptistry, I think, at one point. There was all kinds of things there. But as they amassed money, they started, and won't get into the political history of my family, but they started to change the money over into gold. And then they had this stockpile of gold sitting in a safe in the basement of my grandparents' house for years that was dedicated as, it's the Lord's money. It was dedicated to the work of the church. And it was being wasted, just sitting there. And that is unacceptable stewardship. And it since has been, changed and sent out to gospel preachers and that kind of thing. But that is not acceptable stewardship. See, in this distinction, this church, in the time I've been here, but several years ago, had built up a pretty significant amount of money, and the elders talked amongst themselves. I wasn't really part of these conversations, but there was a decision made at some point that, hey, this is a little too much. We need to pull this down. And so it shrunk considerably by just spending the money on the preaching of the gospel and supporting in one-time or short-term spending on support for gospel preachers. I hope I'm representing this well, but I'm trying to give some context for how this is a delicate issue that needs to be handled consistently as each matter arose. And then it came down so low. I mean, it was not irresponsibly low, but it came down much, much lower. And then the whole situation of the church changed because another group started, and we were in different situation. And so we've built it back up a little bit. And so there's, again, I'm not an elder, but I'm telling you the kinds of principles that elders and that all of us need to be thinking about as we are reflecting on how we handle this really good question, this really valuable question. We have to balance responsible readiness for future needs with a sense of urgency to go to souls in need now, and with faith that God knows our future and our needs. So I'm not trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth, but hopefully this is clear that there's a tension that we want to manage well. And this church more than any other group I've ever been associated with, prayerfully weighs these kinds of matters. Just really, as a congregation, I've been in more of these conversations with members than any place else I've ever been. And I'm grateful for shepherds who hear members out as we see needs, who make adjustments as situation changes, but ultimately are just trying to serve faithfully our true master. So I hope some of those principles were helpful as we thought about that. This is a little bit of a shorter question, but this question about how do older saints connect starts like this. How does an older member stay relevant when it seems like a lot of the activities and get-togethers are geared towards the younger members? I'm way past my prime for volleyball, talent shows, movie nights, and games. Some of us have health issues that can prohibit participation. Some things are almost cost prohibitive too. Limited income means restaurant nights are tough. Driving can be challenging too. It's hard getting old. Can I get an amen? Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges that come with, we have a lot of different ages, and each age kind of has its own unique challenges. Some people, well, I'm not old enough to drive, so I can't go to these things. Or some people, well, we're too busy with our family and our kids and all the needs that we have there. And so there's a lot of different needs, but I really appreciate this member speaking up and bringing forward this issue. It's no fun to not feel like you can participate in the things that we just talked about this morning, that it's important for us to have relationships and be able to have this sense that we belong together, and each person, whoever you are, whatever your challenge is, can belong. And this isn't one of those questions where, I can just turn to a book, chapter, and verse and say, well, here's what you do. It's not that kind of answer. So I don't have like an easy answer, but I'm really thankful for the question, and I wanted to bring it forward to the congregation and ask, first of all, what can the rest of us do? What can I do? What can we do to support, serve, and include our treasured older members? And we're a pretty savvy group. We got a lot of problem solvers here. We got a lot of people who are good at saying, okay, here's a challenge. Let's take it head on. So let's start brainstorming. Let's start planning. Let's start serving. And I think half of the value sometimes for some of these kinds of questions is just this. It's like bringing an issue to the forefront for all of us to think about. Hey, none of us want anybody to be excluded, so let's work on this. But I also want to say to those of you who relate to this question, or the person who wrote the question, what ideas do you have? Because I don't know. If you can't play if you can't play games, and you don't feel comfortable in some of those things, I don't have great ideas, but I'm ready to listen, and I'm ready to help make things happen. Because I think everybody needs to be able to advocate not only for themselves here, but like if you are seeing this as an issue, then it's probably an issue for somebody else besides you. So let's go to the next point. Not just what can everybody else do, but what can you do? Like, don't feel that you can't step in and initiate something. Or if you need a partner, find a partner and say, hey, Landon, hey, Josh, hey, Ryan, I think we should do this. We got a lot of older members who don't feel comfortable doing these other things, but we would feel great. And I feel like I'm going to say a stereotypically old person thing if I fill in the blank. But it would be great to do this other activity, whatever it is. And if there's something that seems like, hey, let's just sit down and have coffee together, that sounds great. So here are just a few thoughts. Our assemblies are certainly at the heart of our spiritual edification. It's the heart of our identity as God's people together. When we gather together, if you can be part of that, hopefully you have a sense that you are part of what we're doing here, and you can grab a hold of somebody and say, hey, sit down here and let's talk. And there's a lot that happens before and after our assemblies in that kind of connecting social context. I love the way, Patricia has connections with every kid because, they all love her. It may have started just because she gives them candy, but they all love her. They all know her. My kids pray for her and think about her all the time and want to talk to her, want to, wish her happy birthday and that kind of thing, because she's invested in a connection across an age gap. And there's so many things like that can happen in our assemblies, but we also want to create times and places for other gatherings, like those house-to-house kind of things that develop those relationships. I know anonymous members have funded free tickets to things, no cost. You can get a ride. Somebody will take you. Things like baseball, basketball games. Others have hosted potlucks and euchre nights and other activities. Some have mentioned the idea of sitting around a bonfire in a yard and talking this summer. I don't know if any of those things appeal to you or not. Again, we'll have to think through this together and try to figure it out. But make sure when there is an opportunity that fits you, you do your best to go. Try your best to be there, because hey, we've got the spring sing coming up. There was a baby shower yesterday. There's the men's day and the ladies' day and all of these things. We're trying. We're not always getting it perfectly to be all-inclusive, but we're trying to make sure anybody that wants to, if there's a barrier in cost or in a ride or something like that, that we can make it happen for you to be able to go and be with us in those things. And I'd encourage you also to think about how you can serve others. And I just find that is the best way to make those connections that I want. I quoted a few months ago Ralph Waldo Emerson, the best way to have a friend is to be a friend. And this is just the beauty of the gospel. When we lose our lives, we save our lives. When we let go of ourselves and we seek something for others, as we serve, we start to receive the blessing, because it's more blessed to give than to receive. I don't say that to say that the question is in any way out of line. It's a perfect question. But this is part of the answer, I think, is to focus on others. So again, I hope that is helpful as we think about this. And I feel like this is a third of a sermon answer, and everybody else needs to invest in figuring out the rest of the answer. How do we make sure that each age group and each person with unique challenges is included, that everyone belongs and is cared for? Those are the two questions we received this year so far, last month, and I encourage you to turn in your questions. If there's something you've been thinking about, there's probably a good chance that someone else will benefit from the answer, and I always appreciate these. We try to do them about once a quarter. You can see from where we started this conversation, even from Michael's comments, that at the heart of what we want to do is to be able to stand before Jesus, our Master, and hear, "Well done." To hear a sentence that starts with the word "well." Like, I hear that coming out. Big sigh of relief and a joy that I know I am about to enter into the joys of my Master. And if you're not yet in Christ, if you don't know Jesus, we want for you to be able to stand before him someday, having been a loyal servant of his, having walked with him through this life. You can confess him and be baptized into him tonight. If you're not if you are a Christian and you haven't walked with him and you want strength and encouragement that comes from having your brothers and sisters know, hey, I've been struggling, or I need to acknowledge something that I went the wrong direction and I'm trying to get things right, or you want prayers for something in that kind of a context. If we have a spiritual need, please come forward while we stand and